Hello and welcome everyone online to this event where we ask what is at stake during the ongoing protests in Georgia against the law on transparency of foreign influence, also dubbed the Foreign Agents Law. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Lubica Polakova. I'm with the Russia and Eurasia team here at Chatham House. Before we start, just a reminder that the discussion is on the record and being recorded, so you're welcome to share content from the event on the social media platform of your choice. Our panelists will offer brief initial remarks, and then we'll move to the Q&A. So if you have a question, please use the Q&A function, and I'll do my best to cover as many of your questions as I can. So the so-called Foreign Agents Law, which would require organizations receiving more than 20% of their funding from abroad to register as agents of foreign influence, is widely seen as inspired by Russia's legislation. The US and EU have expressed their concerns about this piece of legislation. The protests against it have been going on for about a month now. We saw around 50,000 people protesting in Tbilisi on Saturday. Last night, there was an overnight protest in front of the parliament. We have seen some very heavy-handed policing, and there have also been reports of civil rights activists being beaten up. So what we're going to talk about today is what's in the law, what's wrong with it, what it would mean for civil society organizations and independent media in Georgia, and also the broader political context in Georgia ahead of the parliamentary elections scheduled for October, and also what the law signals for Georgia's relations with Russia, the EU, and the US. So to do all that, we have an excellent panel. In alphabetical order, Thomas de Waal, Senior Fellow with Carnegie Europe, Professor Hans Gutbrod from Ilia State University in Tbilisi, Professor Stephen Jones, Director of the Georgian Studies Program at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard, and Ambassador Natalie Sabanadze, who's a Senior Research Fellow with us at the Russia and Eurasia Program at Chatham House. So Hans, you're currently in Georgia. Can you tell us how the protests are evolving, what is wrong with the law, and what impact it's going to have on civil society in Georgia? Over to you. And if I can also ask my other panelists to please mute themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Lubica, and thank you everyone for joining. So the word that I would use, and that's a strong word for what's going on in Georgia, is that in my mind, it is a coup. It is an unlawful seizure of power by a small clique that are disabling Georgia's constitutional order. That's a strong term, and I use it advisedly, and I think you can justify that when you look at the broad sweep of what actually goes on, of which the draft law regarding transparency of foreign influence is one part, but it's part of a much, much broader, and if you will, multi-pronged assault, some of which has been going on for some time. Let me first say a couple of things about the law. This is an issue for me of interest. Some of you may know that I've campaigned for transparency of think tank funding, including with Chatham House a while ago. So I've looked at this discussion across various countries, across many countries, in fact. And in fact, Georgia's civil society was unusually transparent when we looked at this in the past, without any agenda at the time to defend Georgian civil society, but just looking at how the actual situation was. You go on the website of Transparency International, of IDFI, or various other organizations that have been mentioned, and within something like 25 seconds or less, you will know who funds them, what they get funded for, and how much money they receive. So the very idea that this is a pressing problem is, I cannot put it differently, is a canard. Now, at the same time, I wrote a report in 2017 on how accountability and transparency is used in order to repress civil society. At the time, we didn't dream that this would become an issue in Georgia. This was a report for Hewlett Foundation, Ford, and a few others under the heading of this kind of transparency and accountability initiative. It's online. I can share it afterwards. And what we see right there in Georgia is almost a textbook case of using a kind of distraction from actual issues, division, and trying to detach kind of civil society from what goes on over there. And this is exactly what's playing out right now in Georgia. The law is a repress anyone you want law. That's what it is. It has transparency on the outside, and what is actually, the way it's configured is specifically to be able to repress any civil society organization you don't like. I'll just highlight a couple of features. I've looked at this quite extensively, and the longer I look, the more I still discover in it that I find that is vindictive. This, again, is the right term. So first, it stigmatizes these organizations. Secondly, it allows the Ministry of Justice regular intrusion. So it becomes very hard to do nonprofit media if every 6 months, someone can come in and look at all your internal things, files, etc. It allows for plenty of harassment. If you look at my surname, you have Gutbrod. There are different ways of spelling that T in Georgian. And this is something that can hold you up when you submit something and you have 1 week, I think 10 business days it might be, I might even be wrong on this one, to correct any record you hand in. But these inconsistencies can kind of slow you down when you hand in for this declaration of who funded you, whether it is one T for Mr. Gutbrod or another T for Mr. Gutbrod. And that alone could kind of just put you on the other side. And if you don't, this is actual things that happen where people get delayed on. And that's just one example. I mean, the name is maybe extreme, but if you don't get the declaration right and you cannot properly satisfy what is being asked of you, you get a fine of 10,000 lari. So this is really, really important for you to sink in, that this is doesn't proportionally scale, but rather a mistake that connects to 1 lari of declaration would lead, if applied, to a 10,000 lari fine. And there is no discretion. There's discretion about whether one applies it or doesn't apply it, but the fine itself is set. And that's just one of the fines. There's another fine of 25,000 lari. There's another 20,000. And it's for if you're directly or indirectly funded. So you're even uncertain whether you might be able to accept money from sponsors that earn their money abroad in various ways with export, because that could be indirect money. There is, in other words, with that, no way that as a civil society organization you can operate legally. And if I say this having previously run a civil society organization, I can also tell you that from personally being involved with a dog shelter where I volunteer and regularly donate. And we talked about this regularly. Some of you may have seen that in my article. It would not be possible for that dog shelter to operate legally, doing raffles, etc. And if you don't know where the money is coming from, you have to assume it is foreign without being constantly exposed to the risk of large fines that in a Georgian context, a 10,000 lari fine, that would be about 3,000 euro, 3,400 euros. Almost no Georgian civil society organization has that cash in hand, and certainly not core funding in hand to pay for that. So this is a repress anyone you want law. And for that reason, also disability organizations have campaigned against that. It's very important, except for kind of blood donations and sports organizations. It covers absolutely the full range of organizations. Why is it a coup? There is a couple of other things, because you have to see this in the broader context. In the constitution of the Georgian Constitution, Article 78 highlights the obligation for state structures to promote the kind of westward integration that Natalie Sabanadze, when she was in charge in Brussels as an ambassador, promoted. And this runs squarely against it. Now, you might say you don't like the constitution, but then you actually need to change it. Otherwise, you're directly acting against it. There are a few other things. As former security officials have pointed out, this is a real, what's happening is a collapse of the constitutional order. Former Prime Minister Georgi Gaharia, who's still remembered for himself also being quite heavy-handed when he was a Minister of Interior, has pointed out that these many attacks that we've seen last week on civil society activists could not have happened without direct participation of the Ministry of Interior and State Security. The people knew the phone numbers, they knew the addresses, they knew where their parents lived. They beat up a 73-year-old father of a LGBT activist of Tbilisi Pride because they couldn't find her. If the former Prime Minister, Georgi Gaharia, who was in the Georgian Dream government in better days, in my mind, that the turning point is in 2021, if he tells you that the government is involved, I think you can be fairly confident that that's the case. And for the terrible beatings, some of them just a few 100 meters from where I am right now, a driver being hit over and over in the face, we don't really see any accountability. This is condoned top down. The same has happened in the cultural sector. check Maya Yagi's great article in the New York Review of Books. This was a year ago, and it's gotten even worse. There's practically the entire cultural sector has been purged for political reasons. And when one talks about political NGOs, this is often, again, a framing that is being pushed, so to speak, to people abroad. Well, but these NGOs are so political. Well, yes, they are political because they point out that 30 MPs have allegations of corruption against them that are unresolved. 30 cabinet members have allegations of corruption against them. This is all has escalated since 2021. And then if you think that pointing out corruption is highly politicized, of course, then you'll see these people as enemies. All of this happens in a context where, as I said, corruption increases greatly. And the business environment in Georgia, which I can also speak about because I've experienced in this and I'm actively involved in another capacity, has gotten dramatically worse. Some of this has been scrubbed out of reports. That's simply the case. But it is very visible. We've seen great interference in the National Bank of Georgia, which up to now was a kind of landmark institution, highly respected, that I also worked with in various respects, and really had a very positive experience. That's gone. We've seen strange tax amendments that make it possible to repatriate money that has previously not been taxed. And we also see, and this almost flies under the radar in this kind of massive assault that is currently going on, we've seen a subordination of the pension fund of Georgia, pension agency, into a kind of pension fund that now is in the political vertical, and where 5 billion lari that belong to the Georgian citizens are now under political control, and that bodes very badly. So these are strong words. This is, if I describe it as it is, I think the source of it is in a kind of Macbethian rage that Bidzina Ivanishvili has worked himself into, where he deals with a kind of specter of his own projection, with merging ideas of a global war party with his own battle with Credit Suisse. And I think it is very important not to see these things as small things in isolation, but to look at the very big picture, of which the transparency law is one part. And with that, I think 10 minutes. Thank you very much. I look forward to questions. One thing in particular, I also have some ideas, I think, about what can be done and what should very concretely be done, but we can cover that in the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Hans. And now we turn to Stephen. So Stephen, Hans already made some points about the kind of bigger picture. So could you tell us more about the political picture in Georgia, and specifically how you think the situation could evolve in the run-up to the parliamentary elections in October? And you need to unmute yourself.
Lubika, thank you. Thank you for organizing this, and thanks to Chatham House. I've sort of gathered my thoughts here. My brain doesn't work so well, so I've written it all down, but I'm not going to be boring about the way I present this. But hopefully I'll give you as much human life in the presentation as I can. All right, so the Georgian Dream government is at war with Georgian society. Hans described it as a coup, or attempted coup. The government clearly, in my mind at least, is teetering, but it has not yet fallen. There are plenty of rebellions, but political revolutions, which I think this situation is careening towards, or the forcible transfer of political power from one social or political group to another, are rare events. It requires a confluence of conditions and events. That would include, as Jack Goldstone, an American political scientist, puts it, 4 conditions. I'm talking about conditions for a political revolution. A government which appears, quote, irredeemably unjust, end of quote, and vulnerable. Secondly, a challenge from a broad-based section of the citizenry mobilized in the streets. Thirdly, elites unwilling to defend the government. And finally, international powers unwilling to intervene to defend the government. And one can think about the Rose Revolution in 2003, where neither the US nor Russia wanted to save Shevardnadze. These 4 conditions were met more or less in 1992 when Gamskhurdia was ousted, and most certainly and very clearly in 2003, when Shevardnadze was forced to step down. So we are seeing something similar today, which is part of a pattern of Georgian politics over the last 3 decades. I'll get to that in a minute. But for now, the government is in power, and the challenge to its legitimacy goes way beyond the so-called foreign agents law. It is about democracy, it's about Europe, it's about Russian imperialism in Ukraine and at home in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and of course it's also about geopolitics. But it's also about corruption, inequality, and the lack of access to power by ordinary citizens. That distant power is currently represented by in the popular mind at least, by Ivanishvili, with his hold over the government and the economy. This disproportionate power in his hands is his and the government's weakness. The unjust nature of the system for Georgians is exemplified by the overwhelming power of a single oligarch who can transform Freedom Square with his unpopular Panorama project or reduce taxes on the repatriation of his offshore accounts. But the challenge is also generational. A movement driven by urban youth, which has grown up under nothing but GD rule, Georgian Dream rule. Georgians are leaving the country in large numbers. According to Geostat, in 2023, the number of residents leaving Georgia doubled over 2022, and 66% of the immigrants were Georgian citizens of working age. This reflects deep social and economic problems in Georgia, and this is also part of the explanation as to why such large numbers are willing to come out onto the streets. They are clearly unhappy with unaccountable government. The government's survival depends on a very narrow social and economic base, represented by some businesses, by the church, and by control over a largely passive rural population. The government still has the police, the civil service, and the army, but that could change quite quickly. The government has a plan. It thinks it can exhaust the protests and divide the population sufficiently to get it to the October elections. I believe it is miscalculated, as governments often do when they try to preserve their power during a crisis. Successful political revolutions are usually generated by forced government errors. This government, and Hans has referred to this, in desperation, is committing many mistakes, using violence and intimidation, all publicly visible and all shared across the internet, which only deepens the chasm between government and citizenry. The Georgian Dream has completely lost Georgian youth, and I suspect a whole chunk of its own voters who want to integrate with Europe. So much depends on the street. So far, it's a peaceful movement, one of civil resistance in the tradition of other successful political revolutions in India, the Philippines, Central Europe in 1989. If the movement is provoked into violence, then the government will have the excuse it needs to restore order. The current movement's strength is also its non-party nature, but that's also perhaps its weakness. The Rose Revolution, for example, had a leader, a team, a strategy, and an ideology. And to succeed today, the protesters need alliances with other sections of the population, civil servants, metro workers, diplomats, bus drivers. Civil disobedience depends on the broad involvement of all social groups and a plan of persistent boycotts and strikes. However, and I'm going to finish here, Georgian Dream is doomed, in my view. The signs of decay are becoming clearer. Growing disaffection among elites. We've seen the ambassador of France, for example, resign. TV journalists are leaving pro-government channels. We see everyday acts of resistance beyond Liberty Square in the provinces and visibly on the street. Hans again referred to one driver who was beaten up simply because he was blocking the way for a police bus. And now we see also a tentative move by the government to make some concessions. Georgian Dream no longer has any good choices. It can intensify repression, which will take it closer to Russia and lead to even greater isolation, or it can enter into negotiations with the people, which will make it impossible to control the elections in October. It will lose the elections unless it massively cheats. So it's either authoritarian rule in alliance with Russia, which no doubt will end very badly for Georgian Dream, or it's democratic concessions and Europe, which will also be destructive for Georgian Dream. And unfortunately, Georgian Dream has destroyed any middle space. Lubika, have I got just 1 minute?
Yes, sure, please.
Final word then. If this 3-decade cycle in Georgia of revolt, democratic hope, and disillusionment is to end, and that's as a pattern over the last 3 decades, then current institutions need to be changed to increase popular engagement and control. That includes economic reform to end the deep social and economic inequalities that undermine citizen trust in government. Elections on their own, and some of you have already heard me say this many times, are never enough, as the last 3 decades have shown. They won't end the cycle of professional politicians sparring in Georgian parliament, and Georgian parliament is a very narrow political space, generating yet another wave of popular frustration and disillusionment. Georgia requires new forms of democracy, and that should be left to citizens to devise in what I suggest would be something like a constitutional convention. This is a unique opportunity to involve citizens in governing themselves, or at the very least, ensuring their governors are accountable through institutions active between elections. The geopolitical stakes are also very high. If the people don't win this, then not only Georgia will fall into the Russian shadow, but very likely neighboring Armenia will also buckle under once more. Okay, I think that's enough. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Stephen. So now I'm going to turn to Tom. And Tom, you promised to tell us more about the broader geopolitical context in which the government's actions are situated. So what has what do you think has pushed the government to try with this law once again, given that they previously tried last year?
Sure, and so thanks very much, Lubitz, Chatham House. Great to be with you all. Yes, I've got the interesting task of talking about the geopolitics and also the Russia angle, which I think is actually a bit hard to pin down, but I will try. Certainly, there's been a shift in the last few years, both in the domestic context, as we've heard from both Hans and Stephen, and also in the geopolitical context. And I think this is incredibly important. I would say up until 2020, on foreign policy issues, there was really not much to divide Georgian Dream and the opposition. There were some differences on Russia, but there was no suggestion of restoring diplomatic relations with Russia, which were broken in 2008. There was both, government and opposition were draped themselves in the Georgian flag. They were patriotic, but they were also committed to European integration. That began to change around 2020, 2021. A kind of stronger sovereignty discourse began to be heard from Georgian Dream. And I think it's no coincidence that there's a kind of model of various in-between countries which are also adopting this kind of foreign agent legislation and are also adopting this sovereignty discourse, this absolute sovereignty anti-globalist discourse, this anti-globalist discourse which actually has support from both the extreme left and the extreme right. And I'm talking about Hungary, Serbia, Azerbaijan, Turkey. All of these countries, I think, have a similar profile. They're quite opportunist, but they all also adopted this super conservative ideology. And Georgian Dream symbolically used to be allied in the European Parliament with the centre-left parties and is now allied with the far right. And for the last 2 years, the prime minister of the time from Georgia has gone to Hungary to join the CPAC, this ultra-conservative convention. And I think that's very indicative. So what we've seen is Georgian Dream joining what I would call illiberal international. And I think a very symbolic and dangerous moment. In fact, I think Hans and I were in the same crowd in Tbilisi in July 2021 when there was an attack on gay pride, and I think that was a kind of symbolic, performative act of that we are, moving against these, sexual deviancy. We're defending family values and so on. I think that was a very important moment. Then, of course, we have the Ukraine war of 2022, and then a kind of heightened geopolitical insecurity for everyone in the neighborhood. Everyone adopts a different strategy. And I see, and from Georgian Dream, you're getting this very strong discourse. We're keeping Georgia out of the war. The opposition wants to drag us into a second front supported by Europe in the war in Ukraine. That's part of the discourse. And I think that comes from a sense of vulnerability. I'm not one, I'm dissenting from a kind of popular view that Ivanishvili and Georgian Dream are taking instructions from Russia. They want to align closely with Russia. I see this more as a strategy of a country, of a government, which says we're moving closer to Russia to keep them out rather than to invite them in. I think this is, Ivanishvili is obviously a very interesting case himself. He obviously, operated in this Russian political culture. But of course, the other interesting thing about Ivanishvili is that he left Russia in 2002. So he's someone who knows and understands Russia, but also got out. And I think that twin aspect of his relationship with Russia is quite important. Now, the other aspect is economic, and I think it's it's important to mention. This is a government which is also a business elite because of grouped around Mr. Ivanishvili and his coterie of, businessmen, advisors, and politicians. And the Ukraine war, let's be frank about it, gave economic opportunities. This is true of the whole of the South Caucasus and Central Asia, opportunity to re-export goods to Russia because of Western sanctions, to increase trade with Russia, to be a transport route, which reopening flights with Russia, including, you can now fly from Tbilisi to Nice, and no Georgian is doing that, but lots of Russians are arriving in Tbilisi and getting on a flight and flying to Nice. And, we all understand where that's coming from. So there's a lot of middlemen here who are dealing with Russia. And I think that means that Georgia still has no diplomatic relations with Russia. There's no embassy. There's no formal institutional contacts, but there's a lot of middlemen. I'm sure a lot of contacts going on. Contacts, I think, between the security services as well. And this, I think, is a key background. They're enabling this business elite to make money, and they're also, I think, sending signals, and I think sometimes perhaps sending threatening signals, which is why Ivanishvili, the paranoia that the Macbeth paranoia that Hans referred to, I think, is partly coming from. This is all encapsulated in a speech, which if you haven't read, I urge you to read. The full text is on georgiacivil.ge on April 29th, when Ivanishvili, who's generally quite a reclusive figure, came out and gave this speech in defense of the law, and basically saying that the Rose Revolution was a coup, the UNM was a foreign-appointed government, they weren't elected by the Georgian people, and linking the opposition, NGOs, and the West all together in this kind of conspiracy to undermine him. No mention of Russia, and again, this sovereignty discourse. Interesting line was, "We are not the Georgia of Shevardnadze. We're not the Ukraine of Yanukovych. Proud that we are, as it were, keeping Russia at bay. That we have our sovereignty." Blaming both the West and the UNM for betraying Georgia in 2008. So a lot of this kind of paranoid discourse, which I think we have to take very seriously. So just to conclude, a few words on Russia itself, because I've been working on this myself. I have a couple of pieces coming out quite soon about Russia's policy in the South Caucasus. I think the South Caucasus has, in a sense, been breathing a bit of getting a bit of breathing space because of the Ukraine war. Obviously, that could be temporary. We've seen Russia treating the South Caucasus countries more like partners than as clients. Particularly, Azerbaijan has an enormously enhanced role as the switch from Armenia to Azerbaijan being Russia's main partner in the Caucasus. This is all about, I think, a tactical withdrawal from Russia as a predominantly security and military power in the Caucasus, exemplified by the unprecedented withdrawal of a Russian peacekeeping force from Nagorno-Karabakh, which happened last month after the peacekeepers stood aside in September 23. And then Russians also, I think, withdrawing some of their forces from Abkhazia and South Ossetia for Ukraine. So I think this is the overall context, but of course that could change at any moment. And I think Russia could, as we know, Russia does have troops in South Ossetia, only about 50 kilometers or so from Tbilisi. I don't see a scenario, to be honest, in which Russia makes a full intervention in Georgia. I think that's too outlandish. They have no one supporting them on the political scene. But Russia has the capacity for disruption, for cutting the east-west road, the pipeline, and so on. And so this is also a scenario that needs to be anticipated, however unlikely it might look at the moment. And certainly if the unrest gets worse, and certainly if Georgian Dream falls, then Russia, which I think is a contented spectator at the moment of events, might be more visible, unfortunately. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Plenty to follow up on during the discussion. But now I'll turn to Natalie. So, Natalie, the EU has already voiced concerns about the law, the foreign agents law, saying that it would be incompatible with Georgia's declared EU membership aspirations. So, could you tell us why the law is incompatible, and also how Georgia's relations with the EU and other Euro-Atlantic partners are likely to evolve if the law goes ahead as planned?
Yeah, with pleasure. Thank you, Lubica. It's not easy to go last, but I think I will echo quite a few remarks that have been made before me. Now, one thing that is obvious watching these protests is that European Union is one of the protagonists of these protests, and you can see it through the symbolics. There's Georgian and EU flags everywhere, and even the main slogan, these protests go under "No to Russia, yes to Europe." And Europe here is more than just membership in the European Union. I see Europe, the way protesters refer to it, as a metaphor. And it is a metaphor for many reasons that actually Stephen talked about. One of them is this national self-identification of Georgians as Europeans. It has almost the status of a national myth. It is about democratic governance, about rule of law, life and dignity, with full respect for individual rights and freedoms. And most importantly, it is a metaphor for freedom, and for individual freedom and national freedom, because most of Georgians would agree that the only free Georgia in Russia's neighborhood is European Georgia. And if there has been one constant in Georgia's foreign policy since restoration of independence, it was the pursuit of European and Euro-Atlantic integration, and that was really continuously pursued by all governments, including this one. So in the latest foreign policy concept that was adopted by the Georgian Dream, it is there. The constitutional obligation that Hans referred to was actually put in the constitution by the government of by the majority of the Georgian Dream. So it is precisely in this context that this U-turn is very striking. Of course, they don't agree. They don't admit that the U-turn is taking place because 80%, according to all the polls, around 80% of the population continues to support this European integration. So it would be suicidal for any political party to go out and openly say, we're changing the course. So they insist that they continue, but they say one thing and they do something that is completely the opposite and actually undermines Georgia's EU prospects. So this bill targets all the above symbolic and direct manifestations of what Europe stands for and what these people are fighting. First of all, both in its letter and spirit, and especially in the communication by the authorities that surrounds this law, it's basically legalizing arbitrariness and handing a weapon, an instrument, a legal instrument for suppressing dissent to the authorities. And the communication that I mentioned that is absolutely fabuling, striking to hear from the entire hierarchy of the Georgian Dream, really does not mask the real intent of this law. And I completely agree with the characterization that this is a coup d'etat. In fact, the Georgian Dream has declared l'état c'est moi. They're identifying the Georgian Dream regime with the Georgian state and saying that any criticism, any attack against the regime translates into an assault against Georgian state, its national interests, and is equivalent of treason. And here I would mention something that brings us to the EU, because the EU, one of the conditionalities for the EU, you see Georgia got candidate status, but one of the conditionalities that stayed both before and after is this request, so to say, to contribute to depolarization, because Georgian politics is traditionally very polarized. Now, this notion of depolarization is being completely abused by the Georgian government, also in the context of this law. Now, they have done this before, and I think it was a mistake from the EU not to react to it and basically let this kind of abusive interpretation of depolarization. But what they're saying is that all the civil society organizations, individuals, academics, political parties, everybody who is critical is actually contributing to polarization. So we need to silence them because that gets us to the EU. So this kind of interpretation of depolarization is extremely harmful and I think should have been rebutted earlier on, but now we see its return. Another point is the weaponization of transparency. And, you know, we've heard from Hans that there is no urgency to increase and improve transparency in Georgia, to the contrary. But the justification that is used is this is based on the European norms of transparency and accountability. So we're going to approve this law. It will become, it will help Georgia become more like European democracy and help with the European integration. And that, of course, despite all the statements and opinions to the contrary. It is also been referred or compared to the analog of FARA, American legislation, and some of the European legislations. There is one major difference, both legal, I mean, apart from the motives, that there is a big difference. This bill makes a direct connection, an automatic connection between receiving foreign funding and being a foreign agent. And this is a big difference with all the other legislation, including FARA, which targets hostile countries and was introduced against Nazis and the Soviets in the 30s. But that context aside, you have to have a proven link that the organization's activities serve the interests of the funder. This is not there. It's also not clear whose interests and whose interests, whose influence is this law sort of promoting, because it could be a state, it could be an agency, it could be an international agency, or a donor, a physical person, a charity, and so on. So it is a very untransparent bill on transparency, and I said a perfect case of a weaponization of transparency. The most similar law, of course, is the Russian and the Hungarian, one of the 2017, which European Court of Justice forced Hungary to withdraw. Now, to back a little bit more what Hans had said in terms of what's wrong with the law, but from the point of view of the European, not only values, but European law and international law. First of all, it interferes with the freedom of expression by affecting their right to good reputation. This is against EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, ECHR, European Convention of Human Rights, and the ICCPR. It violates freedom of association, discriminating NGOs on the basis of the sources of the funding. And this is not considered under international law to be a legitimate basis for discrimination. Again, EU Charter, ECHR, ICCP. No consultation has been held before adoption of this law. Not only consultation. I mean, last year when they tried to adopt this law, they took it back and promised that they're not going to go back to it. Now they have put it back on the table and basically shoving it down the throats of everybody through very quick adoption. And they basically suspension of normal parliamentary procedures, because today the third reading took grand total of 1 minute and 7 seconds, and no opposition was allowed. And finally, it has disproportionate punishment. The fines levied on NGOs are huge. This is going to destroy their functioning, make it impossible. So the principle of proportionality is also not reflected. Now, finally, I want to talk about the EU response to all this. There have been a lot of statements. Von der Leyen said Georgia is at the crossroads, calling the government to withdraw the law, return Georgia on the path of European integration. Today, so we can see the differences. There is much stronger position of the European Parliament. MEPs call on actually sanctioning some of the members of Parliament and government officials who push it. And 12 foreign ministers today sent a letter to High Representative Borrell asking for explanation of what is going on and how it's going to affect Georgia's integration, and showing concern. At the same time, I hear that the Commission is taking a more conciliatory position, and one of the conditions that Stephen mentioned, which is international powers unwilling to interfere to defend the government, may not quite be present there. Commission, in the best of the European traditions, is trying to negotiate with the ruling party and offer amendments. Well, you may say, why? Again, it is in the traditions of the EU to negotiate, no winners, no losers, kind of a compromise approach. They can say that they're not interested in the regime change and want to diffuse the crisis and not to alienate Georgia and push it closer to Russia for the reasons that Tom referred. I think it's a mistake. I think it would cause a huge reputational damage to the European Union, particularly among the protesters, and it's hundreds of thousands of people that are standing out there. Most importantly, there is a trust issue. I mean, they dropped this law and brought it back. Okay, they might amend it because this is a face-saving, basically, solution to the government, but why? How can we be sure that they're not going to re-amend it, making it bad again? In fact, I'm pretty sure that they will amend it, but they will amend it in the direction of latest Russian amendments, which actually bans foreign agents from running, taking part in the elections and observing elections. And that's where they're going to go. Finally, they're offering legitimation to the political power, which has lost its legitimacy. The motives of adopting this law are illegitimate, and the means with which it defends them are also illegitimate. So basically, as Stephen said, it's a party which is bankrupt, and now the European Union might come in and save it. And to sum up, so I don't think it's going to be good neither for Georgia nor for the EU. And to say, I didn't have much time to speak about United States, the same kind of confrontation there. If the government is waging a war against its own people. To echo Stephen, the government is basically in the Cold War with all its international partners, Western partners. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalie. So I see some questions have started to come in. There are questions on the internal situation and questions on the international context. So I suggest we start with the internal context. And all of you touched on how the Georgian Dream government is losing legitimacy. So my question is then, okay, who are the other players then on the scene? And is there potential for a strong opposition to get organized ahead of the elections? Because at the moment, at least from where I sit, the main opposition party, the United National Movement, they themselves lost power in 2012 because the population was quite disillusioned with how they were running the state. So, what are the forces? What are the issues or the people that we might be leading the opposition? And a related question that one of our participants is asking about the role of the church. So if any of you like to comment on that, please do. Natalie, why don't we start with you this time? No rest for you.
Thank you, Ljubica. On the opposition and the kind of leadership of these protests, again, Stephen said that this is kind of a grassroots-driven, not very politically organized protest, which is both its weakness and a strength. I think we have seen many protests in Georgia. And if we compare these ones to the previous ones, this is definitely striking, the kind of diffuse, horizontal, grassroots participation, organization, and the presence of the young generation. This is very striking. It is the generation that grew up in free Georgia. Now, in many respects, this is a reflection. I think it is a reflection that the society itself, those who are out there, are more mature. They have a more ability to organize themselves. There are all these informal groups that are put together through Facebook, for example, Daitova, which means if people are coming to protest from the regions, it's kind of organized that somebody will host them in their homes. I think it's also a reflection of this very fragmented and weak political spectrum. And I would say it's more of a strength and bodes better for Georgia's transition to a different style of governance, because with previous revolutions, you always had one big leader. And even 2012, when Saakashvili conceded the defeat, you had a clear leader with Ivanishvili, and it was pretty much pre-revolutionary situation. If you hadn't conceded, it was ready to erupt. And these kind of changes did not lead to Georgia's democratization. What happened is that in the beginning, you have the big party coming with a huge mandate, huge popular support. Normally they start well, and then end up being worse than their predecessors, which is exactly what we see now. So I think if this revolt, so to say, can lead through parliamentary elections or through other means to a kind of emergence of a coalition of parties that will have to accept that none of them are strong, none of them are indispensable, and will have to coordinate and move Georgia to a kind of a different system of governance for which the proportional elections are perfect. And in some ways, this is why partly this law is being introduced, because the ruling party is worried about not getting the ruling majority in the proportional elections. This might be a very positive development.
Cool, thank you. I'm going in the reverse order from what we had in the panel, so which means it's Tom's turn. Tom, would you like to add anything?
No, I think Natalie covered it. So many questions. I think we should, I can see lots of questions.
Okay, all right. So then perhaps we could talk about, so Stephen, you mentioned ways to get the Georgian citizens more involved in running the country. And also I see one of our participants is asking whether Bizina Ivanishvili is likely to take a more public role in the government, to kind of return from the background.
I don't know why he would do that. I don't think it would do Georgian Dream any good. He's already there, of course, as the honorary chairman. No, that's not the way to go if Georgian Dream wants to retain some support during the elections. But alternatives, right? I mean, Nata referred to this issue that over the last 3 decades, we've seen this cycle of a breakthrough, a democratic breakthrough, and then disillusionment and authoritarian growth, right, in the government. And it's unfortunate, but the opposition's so fractured that it really doesn't present an alternative. And it's very likely that the opposition, when it gets to power, will repeat exactly the same thing that the government that loses power. So that's the pattern we've seen, right? So, and this is a reflection, I think, in part of this vast chasm that we see between the Georgian population and government. That sense of trust, or that bridge that boosts the legitimacy of governance, is lacking in Georgia. And that's underlined also by vast differences in economic wealth and inequalities as well. So, the Georgian population is not empowered to make the government accountable in some way. And so, I've been thinking about other ways of approaching this, and I'm somewhat idealistic about it. I understand that, but it is so. There are other ways of involving the population through enhanced powers in local government, for example, or through ballots of one kind or another on different issues. Mini parliaments and things like this that focus on particular legislation that in which the citizenry is directly involved. There are different ways of dealing with this, but what's clear is that elections don't work in Georgia. They don't work in many of these sort of regimes, these hybrid regimes, post-Soviet or we see them elsewhere as well. So what do you do about elections? I'm not saying get rid of them, but they have to be integrated into a different type of system, a political system where accountability is broader and exists between elections. Because right now, what happens is that people go out once every 4 years, they vote, and then nothing changes for them. So some opportunity here, I think, given the mass nature of this spontaneous movement, to think about how people can be involved more effectively with their own governance.
Thank you. Hans, I think you had your hand up.
Yes, there are various great questions. If people are interested, I can say a few things about Bizina Ivanishvili, and there's an interview I've done a couple of days ago, but I can also talk about that later. I wanted to say a couple of things with regards to Jonathan Wheatley's question, and thank you for that, the chance of maybe a united front. As Stephen has pointed out in his really great piece in EurasiaNet, which starts with an incredibly strong declarative sentence, and I recommend you all read that declaration of war on the Georgian people, in some ways has been a great invitation to the forces in the opposition. Previously, they needed to make a strong argument about what they can offer. Now it has become clear that Bizina Ivanishvili is not the wizard behind the curtain who somehow captains Georgia through a storm, but rather is driven by his own vendettas and talks about punishing the opposition as if this was his personal task rather than what is left to the courts. So here's the invitation, so to speak, and the chance that is there to create a broad coalition so to speak, to re-establish constitutional order, because that is literally what is at stake at this point. And one of the headings that's been floating around and that people have talked about is one gentleman in Russia where there was a terrible flood, some of the impact most likely exacerbated by government mistakes, where the gentleman said from rural Russia said, position, opposition, it hangs off my leg. And Georgians kind of, I couldn't care less. I want a state. And this is what's at stake. Is it the whims of an individual who has his vendettas with Credit Suisse, or is it actually a constitutional order in which people don't need to worry about being beaten up, where you don't meet, as I did a few days ago, an established lawyer walking, a civil society person walking with a tear gas canister in his hand during daytime because he's worried that he's going to be pounced on. And with that, I think you have a promising chance. And I think it's very important that the United National Movement ideally should not be part of this, because they will dominate any such coalition. They anyway have their own voters. And the middle, so to speak, needs to be attracted. Now, I have one request for anyone who talks about Georgia, analyzes Georgia, or writes about Georgia. It would really be good if the word "the opposition" was dropped. And the reason why it needs to be dropped is because this includes people from Anadolidze to Saakashvili across to Georgi Gacharia, or however you want to construct the spectrum. And it obfuscates that there are very, very different groups out there. And so we should talk about the opposition parties. And we do need to use the right terms, because otherwise simply our analysis will remain limited. Again, happy to expand on other things, but I think this is an important point when we look at the country.
Thank you. Now, not surprisingly, we have quite a few questions about Russia. So, Tom, since you passed in the last round, I'm going to come back to you. How close is the relationship with Russia? And also, since we talked about this possibility of the Georgian Dream government coming under more and more pressure or seeing themselves losing power, might that provide the context for them, getting closer to Russia? So if you're saying that, for now they're taking the law as a kind of off-the-shelf solution, can they go back in for consulting or develop a business partnership? How might that play out?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, this is all matter of speculation. I've sort of tried to answer it a bit. I mean, clearly, one sees evidence of sort of collusion with Russia. One sees, for example, one sees stories, for example, of Russian opposition, liberal opposition people who are suddenly denied entry to Georgia at Tbilisi airport, and someone has, clearly they're on a database which has perhaps been shared with Russians. There's been some evidence of, conversations with Russian officials, but there's not very much that we see on the surface. It's all behind the curtain. It's all informal. So I think this sort of strengthens my belief argument that what's going on is a sort of deal making with Russia, which is still keeping them somewhat at remove. Clearly no Georgian politician is going to get anywhere if they say that we scrap Euro integration, we join the, Eurasian Economic Union and CSTO. That's not going to happen. Abkhazia and South Ossetia, are still off limits with Russian troops there, and we know from opinion polling that still, sits very badly with the Georgian public. So, there's a certain amount of maneuvering with Russia, deal making with Russia, but I think it's a mistake to see that they're acting on instructions from Russia. They're making their own decisions, while trying to kind of figure out what Russia wants and to sort of keep Russia at one remove. That's the way I would put it. But of course, the net effect of this, as we've all been discussing, is that you are burning your bridges with Europe and the West, who have been your strongest partners over the last 30 years. So you're actually, this policy, which may have seemed quite clever a couple of years ago, is actually just basically cutting Georgia adrift.
Thank you. Natalie, did you have a hand up?
Yeah, I want to add to what Tom said. It is very true, and one of the striking features of Georgia-Russia relations is that it is so much under the radar and completely untransparent, as we're talking about transparency. There was one official channel of dialogue, which was there was a special prime minister, special representative for relations with Russia. That was former Georgian diplomat who used to meet every certain number of months with his Russian counterpart. That was Karasin, and it started, and this dialogue, this format was created very much under the blessing of the EU. It was seen as necessary to have some channel of communication. And I remember I used to bring Mr. Abashidze a lot to the EU and offer some briefings with the ambassadors, PSC committee, and so on. So from their meetings. And one of the things that they maintained all the time, he maintained, was that this was not a format to discuss political issues. It was mainly about restoring trade, some of the ties, flights, etc. But the political and conflict-related issues should be strictly held in international format because we don't want to do it bilaterally, not to be bullied. Now, since then, we see this rise of informal ties, and I think partly Bidzina Ivanishvili is not an open leader, and it's probably better for Georgian Dream if he stays behind the scenes. But he has also his links with Russia, whether he's left in 2002 or not. Various, phone recordings, etc., show that the links are there. There could be business links, there could be other links as well. What we see, and it's hard to speculate whether he gets instructions or not, nobody knows that. But what we see is that Georgian Dream government signed the DCFTA, for example, with the European Union. And at the same time, they restored trade links with Russia and actually put a lot of effort in making this Russian trade link to work as opposed to the DCFTA, which was much more difficult, which actually required the investment, but it was, making a quick gains and basically restoring Georgia's dependence on the Russian market, which was severe. And by doing so, obviously giving leverage to Russia to use it for political purposes. The same happened with the tourists and the restoration of flights that went exactly against European requests. They couldn't say, you have no right to restore flights with Russia during the war, but they still decided to choose it. Unlimited and a completely unrestricted access to Russian migrants to Georgia for various reasons, while restricting those that are critical to Putin's regime. And finally, the kind of style that we see today, adoption of this law is also a sign that there is a Russian influence, whether it's direct or indirect. There is more to it. There is this LGBTQ propaganda. There is the protection of sovereignty law. All this I call a bundle of Russian laws. This is not Georgia's priority. It's somebody else's priority. And it can't be coincidental that all these countries that are sort of leaning towards Russia are all adopting this legislation. And finally, these methods with which the government is trying to intimidate protesters today are very Russian methods. This titushki, this was done through Maidan, the kind of phone calls, beatings that is not opened by the police, but waiting at the houses, etc. The kind of campaign of intimidation and smear is also very much, including the posters and so on, sort of putting it all over the public space. So there are a lot of links, whether it's methods, whether it's motives, that demonstrate that whatever Georgian Dream does serves Russia's interests. Whether it is done on instructions or not, that we will not know. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Stephen, I think you wanted to say something. You're muted.
I agree with everything that Nata said. I also understand Tom's point here about the way in which Georgia is trying to deal with Russia, that there are a lot of attempts here to sort of keep Russia out. But the point is, that Russia, as Nata stressed, has enormous amount of levers that it can use against Georgia. There is, for a start, the economic dependence to some extent that Georgia has on the Russian market. And Russia has, of course, used that many times against Georgia with embargoes and boycotts and various other things. But there's also, of course, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, maybe particularly South Ossetia, which is, just a Russian statelet. That one can imagine that Russia is putting enormous pressure, maybe not directly on Georgia, but Georgians must realize what Russia can do in South Ossetia or what it can do in Abkhazia. It could, for example, declare South Ossetia is now annexed to the Russian Federation, or so. It's and of course Russia is not to be trusted in any negotiations, and Putin clearly has moved in a direction of outright imperialism. So I just fear that Russia has enormous opportunities to destabilize Georgia, and it probably or might happen should it look like Georgian Dream is going to be ousted and removed from power, that we're going to see a much more active Russia in terms of those levers that it can use against Georgia. So, yeah, just wanted to say that.
Thank you. Well, maybe you or someone else could also add, how dependent that is on how the situation evolves in Ukraine. How much bandwidth does Russia have for Georgia right now? Hans,
I'll
I think.
let somebody else answer that.
Hans, you had your hand up.
I think that's absolutely important. There's been reporting in the Moscow Times that Moscow is not super happy. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, is not super happy with what goes on in Georgia, because they could have had kind of the Georgian Dream cruise to an election victory that looked relatively likely, at least being in a very strong position after the next election, had we not ratcheted into this. And it's very important. There is reporting, which I think is plausible, that Bidzina Ivanishvili early April instructed his faction and his political leadership to make this law happen. That seems what we hear, and that actually even the people that are defending it very robotically now, if you look at their performance, told him, Kovakhidze in particular apparently told him this is not a good idea. This is what comes out from the Georgian Dream. So Russia, again, might have had a lot of stability, may work the other way. I think there's a threat of a destabilization, but remember that Russia specifically does not want a second front. And so I agree with Stephen that there's lots of chances to disrupt, but I think stability there in some way would be in Moscow's interest. Now, I do think, and forgive me for sounding a bit dramatic, if you're sitting far away from Georgia and you think this is a kind of a spectacle, not spectacle in any dismissive sense, but this is kind of interesting because if this is Georgia, I do think it's important to clarify to lots of audiences in and around the EU that if Russia prevails in Ukraine, this will come to a neighborhood close to you. Because this is a playbook. And you can look to Azerbaijan, where there was some kind of civil society, not great, but there was some civil society until 2012, and it's gone. And this works in other places now, more leaning up against Russia. And that playbook, I think, one should take very seriously. And this, I think, is should underline the seriousness that, as Timothy Snyder has said, it's not about helping Ukraine. This really, in a profound way, if you care about open societies, that's also a fight for you.
Thank you, Hans. Very important point. So we have about 20 minutes left, and we have a group of questions about the internal situation, and then I'll move to a more sort of international context again. So there are a couple of questions about the corruption issue that especially Hans mentioned, and why that is not filtering. So you said the situation has been gradually worsening. So why is that not filtering through and not visible in reports like ease of doing business? Why is that not more visible? How likely is it to how much is it felt, and when are we going to see the consequences if we're not seeing them yet?
You see the consequences every day when you move around Georgia, and it's not necessarily that money exchanges hands. It's known that Bidzina Ivanishvili disapproves of that. There is the belief that Ota Patschaladze had been caught so many times in various transgressions. I could tell you stories. This is the former chief prosecutor who was sanctioned by the United States, that actually he was shifted sideways because, again, Bidzina Ivanishvili doesn't like that. It's not so much that there's direct payment in order to get access, but if you're on the inside track, you get all the permits, so to speak, very, very fast. And those people are fast tracked. And the business environment has radically gotten worse. And you will not hear about it because the people somehow are often quite happy to salvage some little bit in their business and some consolation prize. And there's the saying in Georgia, to find out what really goes on in Georgia, look at the newspaper from 4 years ago about all the factories that were open and all those great investment projects. And you will see very few of those left. So this is pretty pervasive. It doesn't impact, there was this very good question, how does it impact World Bank rankings? No, not necessarily, because the regulatory framework that's on the outside still looks pretty fine. Yeah. I'm not talking about the courts, that's a topic to itself. Those are really in a pretty dramatic shape, though the government is on occasions also lets the clan of judges do their own thing, so to speak, because they're almost a kind of political entity to itself. So it doesn't mean that there's always, typically there is, but there's always a top-down order. But yes, it's a lot worse.
Thank you. Tom, this is something that Hans mentioned about Azerbaijan. So maybe we could turn to the neighborhood and how the situation in Georgia is seen in Armenia and Azerbaijan.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think Georgia is obviously a critical country, not just for itself, but also for a wider neighborhood. And I think what we've seen in the last couple of years is this switcheroo, this Russia no longer having Armenia as its main ally in the South Caucasus, but that role now filled by Azerbaijan. That was exemplified by the withdrawal of the peacekeepers from Karabakh, and everyone's now asking what is the nature of that deal. We know that President Aliyev then went to Moscow, but we again, this is very opaque, but we're seeing a lot of increased trade between Azerbaijan and Russia. We're seeing the import, we're seeing, for years we've been talking about east-west corridors, but now lots of talk about north-south corridor, and which involves Russia, Azerbaijan, Iran, and that was very much mentioned in Moscow. And this is bad news for the Armenians because Russia is no longer their patron, and they're trying to pivot west, but that's very difficult. And so obviously what's happening in Georgia is within this wider context. Russia also needs Georgia as a route to the south. It's the mountains are difficult, but it is also a major route. If you're looking about north-south corridors, it is via Georgia as well. So this is all going on, and obviously you've got this paradox that you now have the most pro-Western government in the region is in Armenia, which happens to be the country which is the most institutionally tied to Russia, and how that's playing out. And I think Stephen's already mentioned this. If Georgia continues to go bad, if the Russians get more influence, if Georgian Dream weathers this out and turns more against Europe, this is very bad news for Armenia's Western aspirations, because Georgia is the only neighbor which has any kind of European possibilities at all. So yeah, this is indeed the wider context.
Great, thank you. And in the last 15 minutes, perhaps we could move to what can be done some of our participants asked about sanctions, but perhaps more broadly, what could be, who can play a positive role inside Georgia from the internal actors, but also how can external actors help, either sort of kind of helping prevent violence against the protesters, helping preventing that from getting out of hand, and also in the longer term to help put Georgia on a trajectory of good governance and increased civic space. So maybe I'll start with Hans this time, and I'll give everyone a chance to contribute.
Great. So I think it's very important to have the right analysis, and so really to focus in on Bidzina Ivanishvili and what I described as that particular turn. And if you haven't read it, it's very detailed, but the Robert Amsterdam's account, the lawyer on the defense of Georgi Bachiashvili, very serving a particular purpose in a case, I think is really extraordinary reading. He's the loneliest man in the Caucasus. As I've recently said in an interview, he's been isolated for a long time. And various things really point out. Again, I use the image of Macbeth because the ranting, so to speak, at the empty chair, where he sees a ghost that nobody else can see, that defines a lot of what goes on there. I think that he personally really believes that the West is out to get him. That's really important to understand the situation. And it's very important that anyone who's here and who knows Georgians in positions of responsibility talks to them, because there's still people that could make a difference and that haven't done that yet. There may be some on this call also. What could the West do? There are a couple of very simple and really important things. A, tell your grantees, if you're funding anyone, that they will get core funding. Remove that kind of the project restrictions, and essentially, from my point of view, tell them that you'll fund them until the end of 2025. Because I talk to people that literally are scared about where they're going to be and whether they have to kind of get on a plane and take some menial job, so to speak, because there's just no livelihood for them anymore. And they cannot live here, literally. So assure that people are going to have some kind of transition with that. B, if you're Georgian, get e-residency in Estonia and apply now, apply today, because you can set up, it's going to take some time, but you can set up an organization. And if you're a donor like EED, then think about creating a fiscal agent in Estonia. The tax systems are really similar. And I don't know all about these things, but again, you can contact me offline on that also. There's a couple of other things that I think are important. I would stop funding Georgian state programs at this point. This is, yes, you may have ideas about improving quality assurance, stop that, I think. And I would say swift and certain messages. If you behave like the leadership of Belarus, you might be treated like Belarus. And you opened the flights, that was your decision, to Russia, but you might not actually have both flights to the EU and Russia. And you can't make the argument that Turkey has the same because they didn't start them at this particular point. So swift and certain, and I would strongly agree with Natalie that this attempt to ride in and save the day, the EU diplomats have unfortunately been duped several times over. My understanding is the word in Tbilisi is, Natalia, you did a lot of work, Natalie did a lot of work to try and have constructive engagement. And this was terribly abused here in Tbilisi by the powers that be. Don't repeat that. I could add more, but I think these are some key points. There are quite a few other things that I think should be done, and thinking about concrete measures, not necessarily that this is going to be the final perfect thing. Swift and certain matters.
Thank you, Hans. Stephen.
What can be done? Well, I agree with what Hans said. There's one issue, however, about the role of the opposition, and I agree with Hans. Have to be careful how we use that word, because that's something very different nowadays, since this movement began. The opposition, of course, has been extremely disappointing. I think it was Disraeli who said, if you want good government, you've got to have a strong opposition. And that's certainly not the case in Georgia. I'm not confident that the political parties can get together and work in some sort of coalition. That's not been the experience so far. Maybe the situation is critical enough that they will do this. The thing with the political parties that exist in Georgia is that they do have the mechanisms in place for example, in the regions and rural areas. They have representatives and structures in place which the political movement that we see does not. Right? It's a street movement. It's a spontaneous movement led by youth and cultural representatives like Lasha Bukhadze and others. Somehow, and I mentioned this in my initial notes, that this movement has to evolve strategically and has to maybe it can use those structures that the political parties have in the regions without co-opting the parties into a coalition of some kind, which I think could be disastrous. And like the 1870s, when the populists went into the people, right, and started actually talking to people, and this is what's required, because it has to also go beyond Tbilisi. There have been protests in Batumi and Kutaisi and elsewhere, but this has to go beyond urban youth. I mean, I've been so impressed with their persistence and their joyfulness in terms of the way they're dealing with it. But, you're facing a pretty fierce government here that still has control over the police, and in particular, of course, the riot police. They've got those coercive levers still. So yeah, I've not much faith in the opposition. Regarding the EU, I think Nata's talked about this in some of her writings. I think, and I'm just so disheartened to hear what she just said about the European Commission. But I think it just has to take a much more steadfast position regarding Georgia, including suspension of Georgia's EU candidacy. Again, Nada's talked a lot about this, about the sort of necessity of a rather sort of consensual policy that comes out of the EU. I think that has to change, and I think it just has to be much more clearer in terms of its messaging.
Thank you, Stephen. Tom.
Yeah, well, I think it smells bad in Georgia. I think we should be seriously worried about certain scenarios. One is a sort of Belarus style mass detention of people, and a mass crackdown. I think, as in Belarus in 2020. I think that's to be seriously feared. The other is Stephen's referred to these abrupt changes of regime in Georgia. Well, the last two in 2012 and 2003 were peaceful, but the one in 91, 92 was violent, and we've got Georgia has a relatively recent memory of civil war, so we should not take for granted the fact that in a country which has that memory, where people have weapons, that there could be violence. So I think that also has to be taken seriously. So what could avoid that? Well, I think leaning very, very hard on the government, and talking about elections, I think, and maybe October is now too far away for an election. You should be looking at bringing forward the election, possibly. That's something to be put on the table as to diffuse this crisis, bring forward the election to the summer, so that you immediately have a pathway to an election, which would give the government a way out. They say, well, we can put this law to the voters in an election and see if the public likes it. They claim the public likes it, so let's put this, see if the voters actually like what we're offering them, and also give those people on the streets also a chance in a more structured way to express themselves. So that's something I think to be considered, because I think we're all moved and inspired by these scenes out on the streets of Georgia. But how long can this continue without the next phase? And the next phase, unfortunately, could be quite a bad one.
Thank you. And finally, Natalie.
Yes, so something that along the lines of what Tom mentioned has actually been not quite the same, but has been suggested by the president. She offered sort of two options. One is to fire this law right now, which I think needs to be done. And then another was if they're, deadbent to adopt it, postpone its entry into force after elections. And basically, again, making this law an issue for the elections. And if the Georgian Dream wins, then I think it will be, we'll have the results and it will be bad news for everyone, and the law will pass. Now, there was also a question about, 80% population pro-European, Georgian Dream takes it in a different direction. How come it's still the biggest party? And I think this is a typical question. It's not only typical of Georgia, but in many of these hybrid regimes where you have something like that, including Hungary and Poland not long ago. There are two things. One is, of course, that Georgian Dream maintained its pro-European posture until 3 years ago. Nobody elected Georgian Dream on anti-European, Eurosceptical platform. And it was also, Tom described how it moved to the right wing, to the kind of far right with all the CPAC appearances. It started out being a center-left and actually being a member of the European family of progressives, Social Democrats. And now Social Democrats kicked them out, and the political migration to far right in the past 2 years has been remarkable. So the change in the identity of the party happened in the middle of the election cycle, which echoes actually what Stephen was saying, that, every 4 years, and then in the middle, you have changes that the electorate has no control over. And we have to think in Georgia how to make democracy work for the Georgian people, and think a little bit out of box, because these traditional political parties, no, they don't work, and maybe because they just don't work anymore in general, and it's outdated. Have a wider representation. Actually, civil society political, I don't see it as a problem. Maybe there should be a political civil society, and also have some kind of a, channel of showing it. I also think that, and I agree from the international response, particularly European response, this really is not the time to go soft on the Georgian Dream, particularly given the kind of reactions and responses that they have showed to us against protesters now. I mean, this is a clear violation. What they're doing is illegal. So a political power that is self-proclaimed normative power, which is European Union, cannot go in now bailing out Georgian Dream, which basically attacks its own people unlawfully. I think that would be the biggest self-inflicted reputational damage I would see. And finally, on civil war, I think the situation is dangerous. It's a kind of a clash of wills right now. The Georgian Dream doesn't want to give in because it would be the second time they're doing it. So political costs are higher than it was in the first time. And also it is a different political party and a different political power from Shevardnadze and Saakashvili. I mean, they both had their own issues, obviously, but they listened to the international and were susceptible to international pressure. This one, and part of the reason why this law is there, is to sort of safeguard this political force from international pressure. So the international levers of inducing change are actually quite limited. So it is possible that out of self-defense they might go for an escalation. I think the only thing that can stop is the survival instinct and the fear that Georgians just won't accept Belarusization scenario. But and also I'm not sure how much of a actual power-wielding resource the Georgian Dream has to do it alone, and that's where the Russian support possibly comes into question.
Okay, thank you, Natalie. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. I think the main point for me is that this whole protest is not just about the law. It's very much a demonstration of broader trends that have been going on for several years now. And there's a lot at stake, both for the Georgian population and for the EU, if they want to retain credibility in the region. But yeah, lots to play for, and a lot of known unknowns and unknown unknowns. So we'll have to continue watching the situation, which we will do. So I'm sure everyone on this panel will be following and publishing analysis. So please keep an eye on their social media accounts and what they publish, and on their media interviews. So we are at time now. So I think we covered most of the questions from the audience, so very well done to our panel. Thank you very much for your analysis and for covering such a broad ground. And thank you very much, everyone in the audience, for tuning in. And I hope to see you again soon. Goodbye.